everyone for joining us for today's special LGIU Australia event on the release of the interim report for the Federal Parliament inquiry into local government financial sustainability. As you may be aware, at LGIU Australia, we have a new theme-based format to bring you with curated insights on key policy topics each month. Today's session is part of March's focus on local government finance and governance. This session forms part of LGIU Australia's mission to make local government in Australia collectively stronger by sharing ideas, resources and connections to tackle the big challenges that the sector's facing today and into the future. So this session is going to cover what the interim report said, or perhaps what it didn't say, what it means and what's next. But before we begin, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands on which I'm speaking from today, the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong Boonwurrung people. I'd like to pay my respects to the First Nations people of Australia, past and present, and acknowledge their stewardship of country over thousands of years. And now I am very honoured to welcome our guests today. So we have Graham Sansom, who's now adjunct professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. And as part of a long career in local government, he was previously Director of the Australian Centre for Excellence for Local Government, as well as Chief Executive of ALGA. We're also joined by Dr. Ed Wensing, who's an Associate and Special Advisor at SGS Economics and Planning, a Research Fellow at the City Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, and an Honorary Research Fellow at the Centre for Indigenous Policy Research at ANU. Ed's an experienced planner, policy and analyst and academic for over 3 decades and has a long track record of working for local government across Australia as a policy officer and practitioner for ALGA as well. Most recently, you may have seen he's been leading LGIU Australia's contributions and analysis on the Federal Parliament inquiry into local government sustainability. So thank you both, Ed and Graham, for joining us. Very keen to get stuck into it. So the first question is, Ed, if you could just explain briefly what the inquiry is and what's in the interim report that's just been released.
Thank you, Jess, for that introduction. I just wish to begin by acknowledging I'm on the lands of the Ngambri, Ngunnawal and Ngarigo peoples in Canberra, the national capital. Thank you. Yes, the inquiry was instigated by a referral from the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government, the Hon. Catherine King, in March last year. So the committee was given a terms of reference which included it to focus on the financial sustainability and funding of local government, or the charging of infrastructure and service delivery, structural impediments to security for local government workers, and trends in the attraction and retention of labour force, or the workforce, and of course the role of the Australian government in addressing these issues. The committee has held 16 public hearings, mostly in Canberra, but also in other places around Australia. They've received about 287 submissions plus supplementary submissions from various submittants. About 170 of those are from individual councils, about 32 from national, state and territory local government associations and regional groupings of councils, and the rest are from private individuals and academic institutions and professional associations and others. The standing committee is a standing committee of the Parliament, so this committee will be reappointed after the forthcoming federal election, and it's expected that this inquiry will continue under the next committee in the new Parliament.
And what about the report that's been released? What were some of the sort of key issues that were identified, and in terms of recommendations, what was in it?
Well, interestingly, the report doesn't make any recommendations and doesn't provide a great deal of analysis. I suspect that this report was done by the committee to sort of hold the page, if you like, that it's in a holding pattern because of the forthcoming election. We don't know when that election will be. We know that it's got to be held by May. It can now be announced at any stage by the Prime Minister. Normally what happens with parliamentary inquiries is if they're incomplete, it's up to the next Parliament to decide whether it will pick up an inquiry that was commenced by the previous Parliament. We've seen that in other contexts, in other committees. Given this is a standing committee of the Parliament, there's every expectation that this inquiry will continue, and the interim report is indicated as such in the final pages of its report. So in many respects, this is a holding pattern by the committee. This is the information we've received. Here it is. And we propose to analyse this and to come back with a final report in due course.
Ed, can I ask you on the point you've just made, because you're well across these issues. Is there a guarantee though that the report will be picked up again after the election?
No. Standing committees, the composition of a standing committee may change, given particularly if there's a change in government, and the majority of that committee might decide not to pick up a previous inquiry. There's every chance it could not continue. Yeah, but that's a choice of the next parliament and whoever's in government. We've seen that happen in the past. Look, this is, my feeling is that it will be picked up. This issue is a burning issue for local government across the country. It doesn't matter who's in government. And it would be futile of if there was a change of government, it would be futile of the incoming government to ignore the momentum that this committee inquiry has so far generated.
Although I guess a key point there is whether it's a burning issue for the next federal government. Because one of the interesting parts of the terms of reference, in fact, really the only interesting part, because everything else we've heard about a million times before, was the last line about the role of the federal government.
Yep.
Why does local government sustainability matter for the federal government? Yeah. And there's a small clue in the Department of Infrastructure, Transport and Everything Else's supplementary submission, where it says that a lot of federal government initiatives couldn't be successfully carried out without local government's involvement. So that seems to me to be, one key point, which perhaps local government doesn't emphasise enough in the submissions it makes. Don't know what you think about that.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. That's why I say that if an incoming government and parliament decides not to continue this inquiry, I think there'll be a bit of an outcry, because the Commonwealth has for now 50 years been providing financial assistance grants to local government. And for many smaller rural and regional councils, the money they receive from the Commonwealth is sustaining them financially, sustainably. Yeah. And without that assistance, they wouldn't be. Of course, the challenge for state governments is to look at the role and model of local governance that might work better in regional and rural Australia, that given that the current standard model of local government really doesn't work anymore. And particularly not in the states where the power of decision making about rate revenues has been taken from them, as you and I have discussed in other contexts.
Yeah.
And the work we did for Central Darling, for example, clearly demonstrated that, for example, the existing model of local government in New South Wales doesn't work in Western New South Wales. And other states have taken different approaches to dealing with local government in rural and remote areas, and what are sometimes called unincorporated areas.
Yeah, and I think it'd be great if the inquiry does resume, if those sorts of issues and questions, what is it about local government that the federal government is really not only interested in but needs. And another one that I mentioned in my submission to the inquiry is local democracy. There's a lot of concern about the quality of democracy in Australia these days, and trust in government and all that stuff. And a lot of that is played out at the local level. It's the old catchphrase, all politics is local. So, you really need to see effective local government providing a platform for local democracy that people value, which hopefully then will, in a sense, trickle up to the way they value state and federal governments.
And of course,
was that reflected in the submissions that local governments put into the inquiry?
Not that I could see. I think there were some individual council submissions that sort of started to talk about that, but my sense of the submissions was that overwhelmingly they went back to, the old stuff about cost shifting, and financial assistance grants are now only 0.5% of tax, and, all that stuff, which I'll be quite frank. I suspect people in Canberra are pretty bored about hearing about it in those terms. I think there are important issues there, but they've got to be refreshed.
So what are some of those things, Graham? Can you expand on, other than handing out cash or increasing the grants, what are some other things that the federal and state governments can do to sort of better support local governments?
Well, I think it's more what the federal government can do. Ed made the point a few minutes ago that a lot of this does come back to how the states administer local government. And the federal government, the federal government introduced financial assistance grants, as Ed said, 50 years ago, and made it very clear that they weren't meant to be just a top-up. They were meant to be all about equalising the capacity of different types of local government in different parts of the country to deliver the services that their communities need. But in New South Wales, at least, no sooner, when there was a change of government to Malcolm Fraser, who was the person who actually dramatically increased the amount of money going through financial assistance grants, no sooner had Fraser increased the amounts of money that in New South Wales, Neville ran discontinued state general purpose funding and brought in rate pegging. So that was kind of working in exactly the opposite direction to what the federal government at that time said it had in mind. And everybody kind of acquiesced in that. And so that's continued in different ways. And I've said many times over the years, what's the federal government doing handing over in financial assistance grants about $3 billion, a bit under $3 billion a year, and then sort of sitting back while in effect the states eat into that, most explicitly in New South Wales and Victoria with rate pegging and rate capping. So, I mean, one thing I think that the federal government needs to do is go back to the 2006 intergovernment agreement, which flowed from the 2002 cost shifting inquiry. But the agreement was not just about cost shifting. The agreement was about financial relations, and Ed's done a great job tracking the history of federal local financial relations over the last 50 years.
Yes, look out for that briefing, listeners.
I thought I'd give you a plug.
Yeah.
Yes. But clearly history shows that what was intended with financial assistance grants on day one and when they were 2%, very briefly, they were 2% of federal income tax. That it's not been followed through. And now we have a situation where, in effect, everybody treats them as just unconditional general purpose grants. Councils believe that they're a right. They should receive them. It goes with their role or their existence, in fact. And for many councils, as Ed said, it maintains their existence. So go back, have a look at the kind of policy framework that they operate in. I think the federal government should play a much stronger role in saying, we're giving this money because ... And we don't want the states undermining our federal objectives with their policies like rate pegging and so on. Cost shifting, very briefly, cost shifting exists and it is a problem, but I don't think it's anywhere near as big a problem as local government makes out. Not because local government isn't faced with a whole lot of extra demands on its finances, but because all governments are faced with additional demands on their finances. And if you want to be government, you have to accept that your role is going to change over time, and you're going to have to find ways of funding that role. And that's why rate pegging and rate capping are such a problem, because rates are a terrific tax. Every inquiry ever has said rates are a great tax. They're Australia's only tax on wealth. And what sort of wealth has increased the most? Property wealth. And we're just not taxing it enough. That's the harsh truth.
And you can't take it with you.
And
do you think that's
well,
likely to be a recommendation? I know it's hard to say or hypothesize around what that might be, but I'm guessing that was an issue that came through the submissions from local government.
well, it didn't. I mean, local government is
Or the
very
peak
reluctant to
associations?
talk about, and the associations, they're all very reluctant to talk about that harsh underlying truth that local government sits on a good tax and isn't making the most of it. And the Productivity Commission more than a decade ago did a report which showed quite clearly that most councils around the country were only using a half or two-thirds of what it called their fiscal capacity, of their capacity to raise local revenues. So that's another big underlying issue that the Commonwealth could pick up, which doesn't involve the Commonwealth handing over more money. It involves the Commonwealth making sure that the policy situation enables local government to raise the revenues that it could.
What do you think's your sense, Ed? Feel free to sort of add there, but I'm sort of keen to understand what you think the sort of next phase in terms of, if it's been quite light on in terms of recommendations, we potentially are going to have a change of government. We don't know what's going to happen there, but what would your pitch be, I guess, to the federal government or to the standing committee about making recommendations? So you've sort of mentioned, Graham, a national policy around guiding those grants, but what are some other things that they should be thinking about, Ed?
I was just going to reflect on the fact that we have a wealth of previous inquiries into this space, one of which was never released. The Commonwealth Grants Commission did a very good report in 2001, which made some very sound recommendations about the way in which the financial assistance grants could be better distributed. The Commonwealth Grants Commission was commissioned by the Gillard government in 2012 to do a similar inquiry, and then once it produced its report, the government had changed to the Abbott government, and they never released that report. So one of the things that this committee could recommend is that, again, the Commonwealth Grants Commission be recommended to do a more thorough analysis of the way in which the financial assistance grants are distributed across the states and then within the states. Of course, in the 2001 inquiry, they weren't allowed to look at the quantum across the states, but only the distribution within the states. And both of them should be looked at. And can I just reflect for a minute on what the Commonwealth Grants Commission did, in fact, recommend in terms of a better way of distributing the money through the financial assistance grants, and that was into three parts: a per capita pool to provide every local governing body with a share of the assistance, a local roads pool to contribute toward local governing bodies' costs of maintaining their local roads, and a relative need pool to improve the equity by providing additional assistance to the more disadvantaged local governing bodies. Now, clearly, there are two groups of councils that sit in that bucket. They are the rural and remote councils with shrinking populations, but yet still large areas of local roads to maintain, which are crucial to their local economies, by the way. And of course, the councils undergoing rapid population growth with having to build new infrastructure to cope with that growth and to provide new services over and above what they're currently providing. So the present distribution of financial assistance grants across local government doesn't reflect that need factor sufficiently well enough. So one of the things that the committee could do would be to reflect briefly on the vast number of inquiries that have been held over the last 40 odd years, take a serious look at some of those issues, and put the Commonwealth in the lead role about, well, why are we providing assistance for local government, and how can we make better effective use of that assistance, rather than just jumping to the conclusion, oh, we need to increase the quantity from X to Z.
Do you get any hints where they're going? It sounds like they've really just summarised the submissions that have been received.
I think they'll run a mile from those issues. As does local government. The issue here is the minimum grant guarantee, which currently, I think what the Grants Commission in 2001 were trying to say is that they were looking to have more money in the needs-based pool.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, 30% of the whole general grants pool, not the roads component, but the rest of it, which is just the general grant, 30% of that is set aside for the minimum grant, which means that every council in the country gets somewhere, I think last time I looked, it was about $27 per capita in grant, whether they can demonstrate any need or not. And I've been, again, very frank on this one, and probably get shot when I walk down the street. But, in Sydney, for example, there are more than 20 councils that get the minimum grant or something very close to the minimum grant. They're all in the affluent eastern half of Sydney. And they are chewing up between them more than $70 million a year of minimum grant money that could be distributed, as Ed suggested, to rural remotes and to fast-growing areas that are struggling to provide enough infrastructure and community facilities and so on. And even if the minimum grant was from the general pool was taken away, those affluent councils would still get some local roads money, and they would still get roads to recovery money. So it's not like they wouldn't be getting any federal grant, but what you would be doing is making a big shift in the proportions of money that go to everybody and the money that goes to the people who really need it. And I think sooner or later a federal government is going to have to address that issue. But I mean, just looking at the performance of our major parties in recent times, they'll run a mile from it, I think.
Can I ask Graham and Ed, that sort of comment around it not being, based on need across, the country, is that reflected in the submissions in terms of, growth area councils coming together and saying our needs are quite distinct from metropolitan areas? So the question is that reflected in the submissions? Is that disparity coming through? And secondly, if issues haven't been raised by submissions, is it still the responsibility of the standing committee to look into that? Because I guess what you're saying is that a lot of the issues that were raised have been known for decades. They've been identified in previous hearings and sort of inquiries and things like that. So what's the remit? I know you mentioned it before, Ed, what they're looking at, but can they look into issues that haven't been raised by submitters?
Oh, absolutely they can. The last clause of the terms of reference is any other related issues.
Okay.
So the committee's got the freedom to do what it thinks it needs to do. Look, the answer to your first question is yes. Some of the submissions from groupings of councils have broken away from the lines being run by the state associations and the ALGA and are crying out for a better understanding of need. And particularly, perhaps I haven't read. Well, I have read those 170 individual submissions from individual councils. The two issues that really rang out for me, the one issue that rang out for me was certainly the impact of climate change and recovery of infrastructure following natural disasters. The councils are arguing for building back better, not just simply replacing like with like, because of the increasing recurrence of these natural disaster events. And they're all over the country. They're not unique. But some of the submissions from groupings of councils around particular regions where there are rapid growth are making those noises about the need for better distribution of money based on that kind of need. Whether they're strong enough to urge the committee to take that next step and to be brave and make a bipartisan, unanimous report about these issues is the next step. And I think that's a challenge for the inquiry. Again, one of the things that was different about this inquiry, about previous inquiries into this space by parliamentary committees or by the Productivity Commission or by the Commonwealth Grants Commission, is that they generally start off with an issues paper to sort of corral the issues into well, what are we looking at and why are we looking at these things, and giving submitters a bit of guidance. None of that happened. And that was why, through the course of the inquiry, I felt the need to provide a bit of a chronicle of Commonwealth local government relations, that the history and the evolution of these, why are we here? How did we get here? What are the factors that have contributed to the current situation, and why are we then looking at it again? And along the way, what inquiries have occurred that have previously looked at this, and what did they recommend, and what do we do or not do in response to those inquiries? So that's why I've created a fairly detailed chronology of Commonwealth local government relations from 1922 through to the present, but with a particular focus on the last 50 years since the financial assistance grants have come into effect. And I think therein lies the challenge for the committee. I think it does need to provide a position paper. It would be really good if the committee comes back together just after the election, decides to proceed with the inquiry. It would be good if the committee could put a position on the table and say, well, we think these are the issues. These are the things we'd like to recommend. What do you think? And put that out for further submissions before reaching a conclusion. And mind you, it'll have 3 years. I mean, the life of the parliament is for 3 years, unless, of course, there's a double dissolution called for whatever reasons, or an early election called. The next term of parliament should run for 3 years, and the committee shouldn't feel rushed that it needs to reach for a final report within 6 months or 12 months.
Okay,
these issues
so that's the time
are going to be around. These issues are going to be around for a while. And if you don't do this job properly, then it's only going to bite you back on the bum later. So do your homework now.
Yeah. And Jess, just to put a little bit of detail very briefly on your question about our councils raising the needs thing, and Ed absolutely, is right. Councils raise this all the time. The issue is that, for obvious reasons, I mean, I can understand it, because most councils in Australia, nearly all, are members of associations. And the associations are very reluctant to divide their members by making a statement like, not every council should get the minimum grant.
Yeah,
so what that then does is it means that the submissions that percolate up through the state associations and ALGA to the federal government, and you can see this in the submissions they put to the inquiry, the cop-out solution is to say, well, we need more money in the pool. Not to say we need to redistribute the pool. Just give us more money in the pool. And I mean, that looking ahead in the current financial climate and the budget prospects for whether it's this federal government or the next one, no matter how many public servants Dutton sacks, the budget is going to be extremely tight. So at the moment, local government, to try and deal with this needs thing, is asking for fags to go back to 1% of total tax. If applied just to the financial assistance grants, that's $2.5+ billion a year to achieve that. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, especially given, as the department pointed out, and as Ed calculated it when we were doing our work, total federal assistance is already not far short of 1% of total federal tax. It's just that what's happened over the last 20+ years since Roads to Recovery was introduced is that more federal money is going in through special purpose grants rather than going in through financial assistance grants. But the federal government is still coughing up not far short of 1%. It's about 500 or 600 million a year short of 1%. And I think for local government to ask for that is entirely reasonable, because, as Ed said, you've got all these issues around climate change and natural disasters and so on, which is most definitely a new area that local government is ill-equipped to fund itself. So if you were saying take it up to 1% and give us 600 million a year in a disaster and climate change fund, I think that could be a very persuasive argument. But asking for $2.5 billion extra into financial assistance grants just, so that they can do more for the needy councils is, I think, over the top, especially when ALGA is also asking in its budget submission for $3.5 billion in new special purpose programs. So I think local government's got to fine tune its its arguments on all this stuff, face up to some pretty tough realities, go for something that's realistic. And if that means that some of the members of associations get their feathers ruffled a little bit, well, that's the price you have to pay to stand up and be a responsible level of government, in my view. And a mea culpa, when I was CEO of ALGA, we didn't run around writing submissions along those lines. It's much easier now I'm retired.
Ed, any? I mean, you've just said a lot there, Graham.
Oh, look, I agree entirely with Graham's observations. The one other quick observation I'd make, and if I could offer the committee some sound advice, be careful that whatever recommendations you make fit within the Constitution.
Yes.
The other sleeping dog in the room, of course, is the fact that direct grants to local government via the Commonwealth outside of Section 96 of the Constitution are illegal, as the High Court has already found in 3 cases, not per se to local government, but those kind of financial arrangements have been found to be unconstitutional. All it takes is for an individual to get relevant standing before the High Court, and there'll be a challenge. So if the committee decides to recommend or go with the flow and recommend an increase of special purpose funding, then that funding should be directed through the state grants commissions in accordance with Section 96 and should be factored into the financial assistance grants in a way that achieve more effective outcomes. That would be better. But if you recommend just another top of the line direct grant funding program to local government, you might be acting outside the Constitution, and I don't think that's wise for a parliamentary committee to recommend.
Yeah, and the point there, just finally from me, is that Section 96 enables the Parliament to attach conditions as it sees fit to the money that it goes through Section 96. So the federal government doesn't have to just sit on its hands and hand the money over to state grants commissions and let the states get on with it. The federal government can use Section 96 in a very targeted way by attaching the right sort of conditions, if it chooses to do so.
And through the relevant statute.
Yep.
Okay, I feel like you've identified a lot of things for the Standing Committee to think about. It sounds like sort of key takeaway from today is really that the interim report that's been released doesn't say much. There's a lot more work for the committee to do to sort of work through some of these issues, and you've sort of raised what some of those things might be. Before we wrap up, any sort of last things that you want to say about the report or about sort of what's next? And we know sort of you've sort of mentioned before around the federal election's going to potentially raise some challenges and change of direction, but what can we expect next, Ed?
Ideally, this is just a House of Reps committee. If the final report of the inquiry is to carry weight, it would actually be good if the committee could be referred to a joint committee of both the House and the Senate. The senators need to be brought into this discussion, and the senators need to understand the issues as much as the members of the House of Representatives.
And what's the likelihood of that happening? Do you think it's sort of in terms of what's...
I think it's a suggestion that I might make to the Minister that the referral be given to a joint committee rather than just a House of Reps standing committee.
Yeah. Graham, any last thoughts around what should happen next?
Not really, no. I think Ed's covered it. All I'd say to my good friends and colleagues in local government is don't start counting chickens.
Okay. That's it. Thank you very much. We might wrap up there. I've just looked at the time. We've been talking for a good 40 minutes. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time. We are going to be having some briefings throughout the month of March that Ed's going to be preparing around the federal local government relations over the last century and in particular in the last few decades. So please watch out for that. And please, I'd like to encourage you to head to the LGIU website where we've got a great back catalogue of a lot of the briefings around the inquiry and the submissions that have been made, as well as all things relevant to local government. So please check that out. And thanks for today, Ed and Graham.
Thanks,
Thank
Jess.
you. Thanks, Jess.